There are moments when the internet stops scrolling, when millions of people freeze mid-swipe because something just happens, something rare, something visceral, something that confirms what we've always suspected about power, that it's fragile, that it can crack. But sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to play the game. This is the story of that moment. Donald Trump was speaking. He was doing what he always did, filling the room with his voice, his presence, his certainty. Someone in the audience challenged him. He turned, looked them in the eye, and said 3 words that would break the internet. "You're just noise." It was meant to silence, to dismiss, to remind everyone who controlled the room. But then Ayanna Pressley raised her hand. Not in anger, not in protest, not in defiance, at least not the kind you'd expect. She raised her hand like a student, asking for permission to speak, like someone who knew the rules and was following them perfectly. And in that gesture, so calm, so deliberate, so impossibly controlled, everything shifted. The cameras caught it. The room noticed, and within seconds, the internet exploded. Twitter erupted first, then Reddit, then TikTok. People were filming their TV screens with their phones, posting raw footage before the news could even cut to commercial. The phrase, "You're just noise," became a hashtag, a meme, a rallying cry. But the image everyone kept sharing was the same. Ayanna Pressley, hand raised, face calm, surrounded by chaos. And the question everyone kept asking was simple. Why did that hand break everything? Because it looked like surrender. It looked like she was asking for permission. But that's not what was happening. What Ayanna Pressley understood in that moment was something most people never learn about power. When someone calls you noise, the worst thing you can do is get louder. So she did the opposite. She became perfectly, deliberately, unmistakably silent. And that silence echoed louder than any speech, any shout, any argument ever could. Because silence, when wielded correctly, isn't weakness, it's a mirror. It forces everyone watching to ask the question that matters. Who's really making the noise here? And in a room full of cameras, full of witnesses, full of people waiting to see what would happen next, Trump had just called someone noise, and the person he dismissed refused to make a sound. The internet stopped because it recognized something true. But why did that hand, that single raised hand, have so much power? To understand why that raised hand mattered, you need to understand who Ayanna Pressley is. She's not someone who stumbled into power. She's not someone who stayed quiet when things got uncomfortable. In fact, her entire political career has been defined by confrontation, but never the kind you'd expect. She doesn't scream. She doesn't grandstand. She doesn't give you the reaction you're hunting for. She engineers moments where the system has to confront itself. Ayanna Pressley was the first black woman elected to the Boston City Council. That wasn't a footnote, that was a battle. Boston politics in the early 2010s wasn't exactly welcoming to progressive black women. But Pressley didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for an invitation. She ran, she won, and she changed the conversation. Because that's what she does. She rewrites the rules by mastering them first. Years later, she became the first black woman elected to Congress from Massachusetts. She joined a wave of progressive women who rode into Washington on the back of the 2018 midterms, an election widely seen as a rejection of Trump's politics. She became part of the squad, alongside Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, for women of color, for progressives, for people who refuse to disappear. And in a political environment where men like Trump thrived on chaos, Pressley developed a different strategy. She learned to make silence uncomfortable. Not the silence of submission, but the silence of precision, the kind that forces people to hear what they're actually saying. While others shouted, she spoke in calm, measured sentences that landed like surgical strikes. While others stormed out, she stayed in the room and made her presence undeniable. She understood something fundamental about power dynamics. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the one people remember. Sometimes, it's the one that refuses to be drowned out. And she had practice. Years of practice. Years of walking into rooms where she wasn't supposed to be and making those rooms adjust to her presence. Years of being underestimated, dismissed, and told to wait her turn in, then taking her turn anyway. By the time she sat in that room with Trump, she had already perfected the art of weaponized composure. She knew exactly what happened when you stayed calm, while someone else lost control. She knew how it looked on camera. She knew how it played to an audience hungry for someone to finally break the script. So when Trump called her noise, she didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she raised her hand, a gesture so simple, so respectful, so perfectly within the bounds of decorum that it became impossible to ignore. And in that moment, she turned his dismissal into his own trap. Because now everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting to see what he would do next, and years before that room, she had learned exactly how to use that pressure. There was a moment in 2019 that foreshadowed everything. It was July, and Donald Trump had just sent out a series of tweets that stopped the country in its tracks. He told Ayanna Pressley and her squad colleagues to go back to where they came from, a racist trope so old, so tired, that even some of his own party members winced. The backlash was immediate. Cable news ran the story for days. Politicians on both sides issued statements, and the entire country waited to see how the 4 congresswomen would respond. They held a press conference, all 4 of them, and what happened in that room became a masterclass in controlled defiance. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez spoke first, outlining the facts with precision. Ilhan Omar followed, connecting the rhetoric to a broader pattern of hate. Rashida Tlaib spoke with raw emotion, calling out the hypocrisy. And then it was Ayanna Pressley's turn. She stepped to the microphone, looked directly into the camera, and said 6 words that cut through everything. This is the agenda of white nationalists. Not, I think, not maybe, not it seems like. She named it, she stated it as fact, and then she stopped talking. The clip went viral, not because it was loud, but because it was so controlled, so precise, that it felt like a diagnosis. Pressley didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead for sympathy. She didn't try to convince anyone of anything. She simply identified what was happening, delivered the information like a prosecutor presenting evidence, and let the statement stand on its own. And that restraint, that refusal to beg for people to see what was obvious, made the moment unforgettable. It was the first time millions of people saw what Ayanna Pressley could do with silence. Trump responded the way he always did. He doubled down. He tweeted more. He held rallies where crowds chanted, "Send her back," while he stood at the podium, soaking in the energy. The media covered it as a clash, a battle, a war of words, but that framing missed what was actually happening, because Pressley wasn't fighting Trump on his terms. She wasn't trying to outshout him or outtweet him. She was doing something far more strategic. She was letting him expose himself while she remained unshakable. And every time he escalated, every time he lashed out, she looked more composed by comparison. That pattern continued for years. Every confrontation, every rally, every speech, Trump would attack, and Pressley would respond, not with rage, but with precision, not with volume, but with clarity. She built a reputation as someone who couldn't be rattled, someone who understood that the real power in any conflict isn't who yells the loudest. It's who stays in control when everyone else is losing theirs. So when Trump stood in that room and called her noise, it wasn't the first time he'd tried to dismiss her. It was just the first time she had a room full of cameras and a gesture simple enough to turn his dismissal into his own undoing. And in that moment, she already knew what to do. The moment her hand went up, the internet knew. It knew before the news anchors could finish their sentences. It knew before the political analysts could draft their hot takes. Within 30 seconds, the clip was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, TikTok. People weren't even waiting for edited footage. They were filming their TV screens with their phones and posting raw video because they understood they were watching something rare, a moment where silence became spectacle. The memes started immediately. When your teacher calls on you but you already know the answer. When someone says you're noise so you become the silence, raising my hand to respectfully disagree with your entire existence. The internet does what it does, takes a moment of tension and turns it into cultural currency. But this wasn't just funny, it was sharp. Every meme was a small act of defiance, echoing the same energy Pressley brought to that room. And within minutes, the gesture had been transformed from a political moment into a universal symbol of dignified resistance. And then the news picked it up. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, they all ran the clip. But here's where it gets interesting. The networks couldn't agree on what they were watching. Some called it disrespectful. Some called it brilliant. Some said she was mocking him. Some said she was simply following protocol. And that ambiguity, that's what made it powerful. Because Trump thrives in clarity. He needs you to fight him directly so he can fight back. But how do you fight someone who isn't fighting? How do you dismiss someone who's already made your dismissal look absurd? Trump responded. Of course, he always does. But his response wasn't sharp. It wasn't quick. It was defensive. He tweeted something about respect and knowing your place, which only made things worse. Because now, he looked like the one who was rattled. He looked like the one who lost control. And the algorithm picked up on that. Engagement skyrocketed. The clip kept spreading. Quote tweets multiplied. Reddit threads dissected every frame. TikTok creators stitched the moment with their own commentary. And suddenly, the narrative wasn't Trump shuts down heckler. It was Trump loses control when Congresswoman raises her hand. The viral spread followed a pattern. First, the clip. Then, the memes. Then, the think pieces. What Ayanna Pressley's hand gesture teaches us about power. The psychology behind why silence defeats narcissism. How one woman broke Trump's playbook with a single gesture. Everyone had an angle. Everyone had a theory. But they all agreed on one thing. Something had shifted. The internet had chosen a side, and it wasn't his. Because the internet didn't rally around Ayanna Pressley because she yelled, it rallied around her because she didn't. And in doing so, she did something Trump couldn't recover from. She made him look small. But the real damage wasn't online. The political fallout was immediate. Within hours, progressive groups flooded Pressley's campaign with donations. Her social media following doubled overnight. Volunteers reached out, asking how they could help. But more importantly, something shifted in the way people talked about resistance. Because for years, the strategy had been to match Trump's energy to be louder, angrier, more relentless, and it never worked. He's too good at that game. But Pressley showed a different path. Organizers started using the moment in workshops about de-escalation and strategic confrontation. They showed the clip alongside training materials about how to maintain composure under pressure. Activists referenced it in conversations about power dynamics, explaining how silence can be wielded as effectively as speech. The gesture became shorthand for a specific kind of resistance, one that doesn't beg for attention or validation, but commands it through refusal. And suddenly, people who had spent years shouting into the void started wondering if there was another way. Teachers showed the clip in classrooms, high school rhetoric classes, college communication courses. Even corporate leadership seminars started using it as an example of how to maintain authority in hostile environments. The lesson was simple but profound. You don't have to dominate a room to control it. You don't have to be the loudest voice to be the one people remember. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop. Stop talking, stop reacting. Stop playing the game the way your opponent designed it. And in that stopping, you create a space where everyone else has to reckon with what's actually happening. The cultural shift was subtle but undeniable. Protesters at rallies started using the raised hand as a symbol not of surrender, but of dignified defiance. Social media users adopted it as a response to online trolls, posting the image without comment as a way of saying, "I see what you're doing, and I'm not engaging." Politicians referenced it in speeches about maintaining composure under attack. And slowly, a new language emerged around resistance, one that valued precision over volume, control over chaos, silence over noise. But the real impact was harder to measure. It was in the individual moments when someone chose not to yell back. When someone stayed calm in a meeting designed to provoke them. When someone raised their hand instead of raising their voice. Because what Ayanna Pressley had done wasn't just a political moment. It was a demonstration of a principle that applies far beyond politics. Power protects itself by convincing you that the only way to challenge it is on its terms. If you're loud, it can be louder. If you're angry, it can be angrier. But if you're silent, if you're calm, controlled, and deliberate, it has nowhere to go. It can't fight what isn't fighting back. And that's when it loses. And then something deeper changed. What changed wasn't just political. It was personal. It was in the conversations people had with themselves about how they showed up in the world. Because the lesson of that raised hand wasn't about Trump or Pressley or even politics. It was about the lie we've all been sold about power, that it belongs to whoever can shout the loudest, whoever can dominate the space, whoever can make everyone else smaller. But that moment proved something different. It proved that sometimes the person who looks like they're surrendering is actually the one holding all the cards. Ayanna Pressley didn't destroy Donald Trump that day. She didn't end his career or change the course of history in one gesture. But she did something smaller and, in some ways, more important. She reminded everyone watching that dignity is a form of resistance, that silence can be louder than shouting, that you don't have to meet aggression with aggression to win. In fact, sometimes refusing to play that game is the only way to win. Because when you stay calm while someone else loses control, you're not being weak, you're being strategic. The moment became a reference point. When people talked about effective resistance, they pointed to that raised hand. When they discussed how to maintain composure under attack, they showed the clip. When they needed an example of what it looks like to refuse the terms of engagement someone else sets for you, they invoked Ayanna Pressley in that room. Because she had done something that millions of people wanted to do but didn't know how. She had made someone else's dismissal irrelevant by refusing to accept it. She had turned your just noise into a statement about the person who said it, not the person he said it to. And here's what matters most. This wasn't about one moment. This was about a strategy, a philosophy, a way of understanding that power isn't given, it's claimed. And sometimes you claim it not by demanding it, but by simply refusing to surrender it. When Trump called her noise, he was trying to erase her, to make her small. To remind her, and everyone watching, that he decided who mattered in that room. But when she raised her hand, she rejected that entire framework. She said, without saying a word, "I don't need your permission to matter. I don't need your validation to exist. I'm here, and you're going to reckon with that whether you like it or not." The internet stopped that day because it recognized something true. It saw a moment where someone refused to play by the rules of a rigged game and, in doing so, broke the game entirely. It saw dignity in action. It saw power reclaimed through composure. It saw what happens when you stop trying to be louder than the noise and simply become the signal. Ayanna Pressley raised her hand, and in that gesture so simple, so deliberate, so perfectly calibrated, she taught millions of people a lesson they won't forget. Silence, when wielded with intention, is the loudest weapon you have. And truth, even in a single raised hand, is always worth watching.